Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again from Film Fanatic headquarters on a Sunday. It is November 16th, getting closer and closer to glorious Turkey Day. I'm a big fan of the holidays, and I like food, and I always love Thanksgiving. For me, I always do seasonal videos. I always do a big show on Halloween. I did a big show on Halloween this year. I've done that every year since I started this channel. I've had this channel for probably I've had the Film Fanatic channel for probably about 5 years or so, but it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years ago that I started using it regularly, and I've kind of repurposed my focus on this channel. I don't really use so much my Facebook page anymore. It's still there, and my Instagram page. My Instagram page had gotten hacked last year, and I was never able to retrieve it or anything. And I have a new one, but I don't really post music stuff. I mean, I should say I don't really post too much film stuff. I have a few things on there, but before it got hacked, it was pretty much primarily a movie page. There's just a few movie things on there now. I mostly use it for music stuff, promotion stuff. And my Facebook page is still active, and I still have it, but I don't know. I had a weird. I just don't really. I don't know. I don't really like the way Facebook is set up anymore, and it's just really dumb. It's just big and dumb. So I switched over to just kind of using YouTube and built up this channel over the last few years, and I just enjoy this more. So anyway, seasonal videos. I always do a Halloween show. I always do a Thanksgiving show, and then I always do a Christmas show, which is a big one. Halloween and Christmas are obviously the biggest. For Halloween, obvious. There's obviously 1,000 different Halloween movies to talk about. But what really rivals that is Christmas. I mean, Christmas is massive as far as movies go. Probably, I don't know, in some regards, almost more. Because you do have Christmas movies in the horror genre as well that are huge. And then you have, kind of straight up Christmas movies like It's a Wonderful Life and The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, the original, which I usually always cover, which is always one of my favorites. I love that movie to death. And it's, short, little 15-minute movie. Movies like Die Hard is a movie I always usually watch around Christmas time. Eyes Wide Shut, and then you have like Home Alone, and there's so many. So I always do that. But around Thanksgiving it's harder. But one of the movies for me that's tied to Thanksgiving so much is The Godfather, because I used to watch it all the time growing up as a kid. We would watch it as a family around Thanksgiving. And it is a seasonal movie, even though it's a dark and violent mobster movie. And it is my favorite movie of all time. I think it's the greatest movie ever made. So I've done multiple shows on that, and I always, I haven't actually watched it in a while, and I need to get a really big upgrade. But in the time being, I've been doing a lot of music shows and still been doing movie shows, of course. But I've been doing these like specialty shows of where I've been talking about music that I just really, really love, music that I've been wanting to talk about, specifically genre music, and music that I feel is kind of tied into the big label of electronic music. Even though stylistically it can be very, very different, but in a lot of ways I just kind of lump it all together because I feel like it's all kind of the same thing. And these inspirations, a lot of these bands I've been talking about, I did a big show on drum and bass and jungle music. I did a show last year on house music, and then also I just did a show on ambient music. And for me, with my band Quantum, those styles of music are the biggest influence. Obviously, movies are the biggest influence for me. And for what it's worth, find constant inspiration from these various genres of music. I mostly listen to electronic based music and then also a lot of jazz. But I love rock and metal and all that stuff too. And but for me, just personally being inspired to just kind of get up in the morning because some days it's hard to do. Those styles really fire me up. And then when it comes to quantum, huge influence, massive influence on the weird stuff that we do. So today's show is going to be all about my discovery and my deep love of hip hop or rap music. And I want to talk about this genre of music, which really, really means a lot to me. And it's a style of music that I, even at a really, really young age, even when I was a kid, I grew up like most kids listening to rock and then into metal. And I got really, and through and through, I was a metalhead kid. And I still kind of consider myself that. And, but I always loved, I kind of feel that like, even at a young age, I had a pretty open mind to stuff. Like I was definitely a metalhead kid, and when I was in high school, I was a total metal kid. I was into death metal and black metal, and I still love that music to death. But I always liked other kinds of music. I didn't get into jazz until like in my 20s or into my mid 20s. I had never really been exposed to jazz. Or funk music or fusion, especially Latin music. But I did have an open mind because I was like really into. I had friends in high school that were really into electronic music and techno, and a couple of them were DJs. So that was like kind of my introduction to them. And then I was really into Depeche Mode. I got that was my first exposure to electronic music. They still remain one of my favorite bands of all time. And David Gahan, the singer for Depeche Mode, is still my favorite singer of all time. And along with that, I also had an early exposure, pretty much when I was the same age, to a lot of hip hop music that was coming out. And I grew up in New York, so that was a big part of the music and the kind of the climate at the time. A lot of now old school stuff was coming out then, and I was really getting into a lot of this music. So I was pretty much a pure kind of metalhead rock kid growing up, but I like to think I did have an open mind even then. I mean, now I like to think I have much more varied of tastes, when it comes to just being a fan of music. And there's so many cool styles to check out. But I like to think, as a kid, I had a pretty open mind because I was listening to like bands like Morbid Angel and Depeche Mode, and then I was into like, I was getting into like Cypress Hill and hip hop and stuff, and then I was into a lot of techno, and so I did have a pretty open mind. And I remember as a kid, a lot of my friends, and I've kind of reconnected a little bit with some of the friends that I had during that time. And a lot of those kids, we were all kids, but a lot of them were like really, really straight up metal guys. Like they didn't listen to anything out of those bands. And there were times when I was a kid where I got kind of ostracized and like I guess picked on for like listening to hip hop and listening to techno and listening to Depeche Mode, because I had more or less a little bit more of an open mind and a little bit more of a broad thing about music at a young age, and I wanted to like, you know, check out this other stuff. It wasn't just this one genre. And I remember there being instances where kids were like, I never really, I did fit in with my metalhead kid friends, but at the same time I didn't, because I had these like different tastes that were not at all tied to that style. So it was always kind of funny. So I always felt from a young age a little bit of like the odd man out, but that's okay. That's fine. I think a person should like what they like, and and we're a product of our environment and what we get exposed to. But with hip hop, it's again, it was pretty much the same time that I got exposed to, the early forms of techno that I got exposed to when I was really, really young, and probably, in eighth, ninth grade. So, and I had two friends that were DJs, and they were doing a lot of techno music, and then they were also into a lot of hip hop. But during that time, like I remember my first exposure to hip hop were groups like Public Enemy, KRS-One, Nas, Cypress Hill was a huge group that I was really into. Obviously, the Beastie Boys, that was they were massive at that time. Public Enemy was another really huge group for me growing up. Um, I also really loved like old school Ron DMC. That was a big thing. But there was a time where I got exposed to KRS-One at Cypress Hill, Public Enemy, and I remember going out and buying all of their albums. Fear of a Black Planet from Public Enemy was like a regular album for me that I listened to like kind of all the time. And then I got into KRS-One, which I got really totally obsessed with. Return of the Boom Bap. Some of his albums are, I think, remain today some of the greatest hip hop albums of all time. Some of the nastiest grooves, some of the just, and then also too, it was kind of my, especially with Public Enemy and KRS-One, it was my first exposure to like kind of social political commentary in music. We're talking about oppression, talking about racism and inequality. And that was like my exposure to that because I had never music that outside of listening to early KRS-One and Public Enemy especially because they were really, militant about it. I had never really thought of music being a voice for political outrage or social political outrage, and so that was a really unique thing for me, and it was a big exposure. I never saw that or got exposed to that kind of commentary anywhere else because obviously like being up growing up and listening to metal and death metal and then eventually black metal, that stuff was never touching anything as far as that was lyrically. It was never grounded in anything in reality. It was obviously an extension of my deep love of horror, and it was just fiction and talking about devils and demons and cannibals and murderers and all kinds of things like tied to darkness and death but it was all and then eventually getting into black metal, and it was all like essentially fantasy based lyrics. I mean, really, when you think about it. And so that's kind of where my head was at as far as music. Even with Kiss, where it was like I've described that experience with Kiss, where it was like this, growing up, reading comic books and loving comic books so much, and seeing them, and having this feeling of like, wow, comic book superheroes actually exist, and they play guitars, they play guitar, and they play drums, and they have a rock band. So everything was like fantasy based, and and then also my deep love of horror films was happening at that time. That's kind of when I was starting to really develop those tastes and those interests. So, but it was interesting too. So, like with hip hop, it was the first time I heard music that I heard that was like culturally, um, really representing kind of the shitty reality of how we are and how we treat other human beings. And so that was a big thing, and I really, it made me think of music differently, and it made me think of the world differently. I mean, because I grew up in a very, very conservative household, and most of my family remains extremely conservative. And so that was, in some ways, it was a little bit of an awakening of being like, oh wait, this, growing up in this supposed reality isn't quite what I thought it was going to be. And it started making me, see, getting exposed to Public Enemy and all, and KRS-One. Like, I started to see that, oh wait, I'm kind of living in this different reality compared to people of color, and even people who are, gay, or. So it was a very different thing, and realizing, wait, there is some gross inequality happening. So it was a real big awakening, and even to this day, I still listen to a lot of hip hop. I don't really. I mean, as far as hip hop goes, and rap, and music and things like that, like, I don't really stay up on a lot of new stuff. I do like some new hip hop quite a bit. Um, One of my favorite groups, like in the modern kind of era, is Run the Jewels. I really love their music immensely, and I think that they kind of, in a lot of ways, they're very politically conscious too. A lot of their stuff reminds me of old school Public Enemy. And I have to say, like, my favorite hip hop album, which I actually didn't get exposed to till later, but my favorite hip hop album of all time is the first Nas album, Illmatic. I think that album is absolutely the greatest hip hop album ever. It's really dark. Um, it's a very intense album, and but it's super funky. Yeah, and it totally captures that vibe of, like, of what it was like to kind of grow up in New York City, in the 80s, in the projects. And to me, it's just really gritty. It's dark. It's angry, and but there's like so much passion. The beats are so funky and so, gripping. And I think Nas was like, on that album, I mean, he really was going for it, and his skill level as a rapper and a lyricist is unprecedented. But I got exposed to that album, Illmatic, kind of later. But I instantly, when I first heard that album, I became totally obsessed with that album. I didn't get into that album until probably when I was in college. And every now and then, talking with friends or what have you, we'll talk about music and hip hop, and that album will come up, and I'll bring it up and saying, yeah, yeah, that's, to me, that's the greatest hip hop album of all time. And that's my go-to, and I know a lot of people out there share those views about that album. I think it's just incredible. Another rapper I really got into, um, at least his first album. I really love the first Notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls album. His very first, his debut album. I love that album. I think that's one of the greatest hip hop albums of all time. It's super dark. Again, it's very, it's pretty, you know, it's definitely like kind of outlaw gangster kind of stuff, but it's such a nasty album. I think his rapping on that album is fantastic. Um, Another album I think that still really really holds up is the debut from Cypress Hill. I think that album is a masterpiece. I still think that album still holds up. I also got really into another group I really really love is Black Star with Talib Kweli and Mos Def. I think their albums as a duo were just absolutely incredible. Some of the greatest hip hop music of all time. And outside of that, when they kind of dismantled Black Star and started their own, individual side projects, I think Mos Def, his three. I think he's got three solo albums out. Those albums are just absolutely amazing, especially his first one. And it's definitely hip hop, but he really broadens the sound. It's a very artistic album. There's influences of rock music. I would say like, especially his first record, his first Most Def's first solo record. I would definitely classify it as a hip hop album, but I think it's broad. I think it's broader than that. I think it's got a you know other influences, but I think that that album is just essential. Huge Most Def fan, and his three solo albums are all equally amazing. I've listened to those albums probably almost more than listening to Black Star, but Black Star is incredible. Um, absolutely incredible stuff. Another group that was massively influential on me and where I really just got obsessed with was the Roots from Philadelphia. Philadelphia Halftime, which was their first album. That album was one of the most incredible albums, and that was a real game changer because it was one of the first albums that I heard of where there was, live drums. It was a live band essentially playing hip hop, and I got totally obsessed. Questlove, even to this day, remains kind of one of my favorite drum heroes, if you will. He played on the legendary album Voodoo from D'Angelo, one of the sexiest albums ever made in history. He unfortunately passed. He died this year, about a month or two ago. Amazing album, but Questlove, like, and that introduction to the Roots, and that was like my first exposure of like, wow, okay, these guys are like playing their instruments and playing live. And then the same thing happened to me when I got really into the Beastie Boys because that was this revelation of, wow, like these guys are like actually playing drums and bass and they're playing this like really amazing hip hop. And they also obviously had a massive punk influence. But incredible music, and it's still music I revisit. As far as new stuff goes, like sometimes it's a hard sell, but there are some artists out there that I do like. I like Brenda Jewels. I think as far as like contemporary hip hop, I really love them. I have their albums. I actually got quite a bit into Logic. Some of his stuff is really really cool. Um, even though it's a little bit more maybe on the R&B pop side of things, but I definitely think it's hip hop. I'm a massive Dojo Cat fan. She's very kind of contemporary. I really love her music quite a bit. So, I mean, as far as modern kind of hip hop based music, that's like more or less as far as I've gone. I guess. Um, and hip hop music has really changed. It's really. I think there's a lot of tremendously made new music in the genre. Um, but there's quite a bit that I just feel like I don't know. I can't align myself with. A lot of the times I felt like those early records, the samples that they would use and the cuts of records were like really unique and they all had a distinct style. And I found over time, there's this sound that I've heard on so many new records, new artists, where it seems like they're using the same samples or drum machines all the time, and it just felt like really repetitious to me. Like there wasn't any real personality. Um, but again, not knocking new stuff that's coming out, but because there is some really great stuff. But I don't know. I always go back to the old school stuff when I'm craving to listen to some hip hop or rap music. And it's like, for me, it's like hip hop, all those bands, all those groups I've mentioned, and those records that I've been talking about so far, are, when it comes to, I mean, again, I love that music to death. It's some of my favorite music, and I think it's tied to electronic music. It's definitely even broad, but it's gotten even more broad these days. I think there's a lot of artists now that are kind of infusing more electronic based synth stuff in their hip hop and rap music. Like there's more and more of that kind of thing happening. But for me, it's like that style of music is a massive influence on me personally, but also when it comes to my band Quantum, for what it's worth. Like we have a tune called Nostromo, which is like purely, you know, in a lot of ways musically super inspired by hip hop, and it's influenced a lot of the other music too. So, and it's interesting because I'm not gonna I don't consider myself a rapper in any way, but I wanted to try to like in that one tune that we have Nostromo, I wanted to kind of like pay homage to that style, but kind of in my own weird way because I didn't want to like do it a weird disservice and like try to rap on the track because that can be really really bad. So, and one of the things that does irk me about like there's a lot of hip hop here in Maine, and I have never really come across any hip hop in Maine that it feels authentic. And it's like hip hop rap music is one of the biggest styles of music still. Um, it's massive style, and there's a big huge scene here in Maine. And there's a so many talented musicians in Maine, but when it comes to hip hop and rap, I'm pretty picky, and I've never really found anything that sounds really that great. I almost find a lot of like new stuff that I've heard in Maine as like kind of almost insulting in a weird way. So I think it's like I think for me there's certain things I feel like um, you're kind of touching on sacred ground. Like when it comes to like really good dance music, you know, and what people perceive to be really good dance music. Like to me, that's really a sensitive subject. And then also when it comes to hip hop, very sensitive subject. And when it comes to just funk music or dance music, to me, it's a very sensitive subject because it's so it's so easy to get it wrong, and it's so easy to like to create something where it's so transparent and inauthentic. I have more respect for artists that like are really influenced by that music, but they're not trying to like replicate it. They'll use it as an influence, but they'll like create something different around it, and where they're not so it's they're not trying to make it into this thing that's inspiring them, if that makes sense. Because I think a lot of the times when that happens, it just comes across as like really transparent and inauthentic and kind of just bad, you know. And it's great to have your influences, to wear your influences. I always think it's cool. Some artists hate it, but where if they get compared to someone or they like, oh, you guys sound a lot like this band's record, blah blah blah, or this thing really reminds me of that. Some artists get insulted by that because they like want to like have their own thing, their own sound, and I get that, occasionally that happens to me, and I I enjoy that because I do believe in that saying good composers borrow, great composers steal. You know, as far as new music, new styles, like that in some ways it doesn't seem like it exists anymore. I think like I think one example of where it has changed and morphed so much is hip hop, and I really Jay Dilla, one of the greatest producers in hip hop. he single-handedly created this really unique style in hip hop, and you hear that influence now. Um, he was so ahead of his time of really changing kind of the rhythmic vocabulary of what hip hop can be and what hip hop can do. Bringing in a lot of people call it drunken hip hop, or it has this drunken sound, and it takes that traditional hip hop sound and kind of makes it more like, it almost feels like it has this lazy drunken feel. And he kind of single-handedly created this style. And that is a big style that has really influenced a lot of newer hip hop. And I love that style. And and it eventually kind of influenced a newer style called trap music, which is another kind of style that kind of, I feel, is really influenced by that style, and is like, three versions or so, or incarnations of what hip hop is or was rhythmically. The one group I really, really like in Maine, but they don't have rappers per se. It's all instrumental based, and I think they're just amazing. Jaw Drem, Jaw Gems from Portland, Maine. They take that real hip hop, definitely that Jay Dilla kind of sound, and it's all instrumental, and they're just amazing. I've seen them play a couple times. But as far as like hip hop groups with like an MC and a rapper and like a DJ or a live band, yeah, it's a tough sell for me. It's a really tough sell. But again, as just a quick recap, my favorite records, my favorite groups, growing up listening to Public Enemy, massive, massive influence. Some of my favorite albums, especially Fear of a Black Planet. My favorite hip hop album of all time, Nas Illmatic, hands down the greatest. Not a big fan of his other records. I feel like he came out all guns blazing with that album, and ever since, kind of just went off the tracks a little bit. KRS-One, a few of his albums are just absolutely amazing. His newer stuff, I mean, he's been around for so long, but he kind of became Christian, and and his music is not as good these days, or hasn't been, but his first few albums, I think, are some of the greatest hip hop albums of all time. The first few records of The Roots are absolutely amazing. Um, Most Def, his solo records, absolutely. He has three solo records out that have been out for a while. Highly recommend them. Anything by Black Star is just absolutely fantastic. I still love the first Cypress Hill album. I think that album is just a classic. Beastie Boys, pretty much any album by the Beastie Boys, I think. Massive, massive band for me. I really love, as far as new stuff goes, Run the Jewels. They have about three albums out. Anything by them, I think, is just incredible. Um, yeah, so much good stuff. So much good stuff. The first Notorious B.I.G. album is an amazing album. Highly recommend that. So there's a lot of good stuff, and again, most of this stuff is, and then Dojo Cat. You can't leave out Dojo Cat as far as newer artists. But yeah, and so that music, that hip hop and all of this stuff. Jay Dilla, can't forget Jay Dilla, one of the greatest. I mean, just so iconic. And he was, which is a style, like I brought up Jaw Gems, and there's other groups doing it, where there's a lot of groups now that were so many artists that were so influenced by Jay Dilla, and you see, I feel like jazz is so related to hip hop too, and so there's been um, a big cross pollination of those styles together, and I really think a lot of that is due to the genius of Jay Dilla and what he was doing, so many years ago, ahead of his time, especially with instrumental based kind of hip hop, and incorporating elements of funk and improv and all of those things. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to do a show where kind of talk about the world of hip hop, what it kind of means to me, and records that really resonated with me and still do, and how it's inspired me personally. The awakening for me around socio-political commentary in music. That was my first time hearing that or seeing that, which was a big thing. And all these records I just talked about are things I always go back to. Always. And it's always something I'll listen to or always go back to. I always get perturbed. Well, I always get annoyed when you talk to somebody and you're like talk about music, and then you're like, so what kind of music do you like or whatever, and then 9 times out of 10 people will say, I love all kinds of stuff. I like rock, or I love all kinds of music, but I don't like country or rap music. And I always think that kind of annoys me. I felt that way with country music for a really, really long time. Like, I didn't like country music because I grew up. Uh, my older sister, was really into, like, well, I mean, this was like 1,000 years ago, but she was into at that time a lot of rock and Kiss and groups like that. But she got really into groups like Garth Brooks and a lot of country, like modern country at that time. And my first exposure to country was Garth Brooks and a lot of pop country stuff. Shania Twain and a bunch of other kind of commercial artists. And now it's like gotten even more commercial and more pop oriented. And so for a long time I hated country music. But it wasn't until I got into I started checking out a lot of old school stuff, Merle Haggard, and where then I started to really love and appreciate that music. And I love the old school country a lot. And I ended up playing in a country band for a while, but that's a whole nother video. So yeah, I just wanted to really talk about hip hop. I do consider, even though it is a very different style, I do consider it a cousin, or for me, it's related to electronic music. So, and it's a real influential music on dance music. House music, trance music, all those things. It's a massive influence. All those early records are such a influence. Even like I did a big show on Anthony Papa, who is my favorite house music DJ. Hugely influenced by hip hop. So yeah, I just wanted to, and I felt like I needed to do a show on this beloved genre of mine. So thanks again, and have a good day. Peace.